Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Tessa Tubbs Podcast, where leadership gets real, practical, and deeply personal. I'm your host, Tessa Tubbs, and I'm so glad you're tuning in. Today's guest is someone I deeply admire, Gavin Naimer, founder and president of Granite International Executive Search, a boutique firm serving the insurance industry. Gavin has spent years helping executives navigate high-stakes transitions, and he brings both strategic insight and human-centered wisdom to every conversation. His firm boasts a 90% retention rate on placements and is known for building long-standing, trusted partnerships. If you're thinking about growing your leadership team or making a move yourself, check them out at graniteinternational.com. That's Granite, INTL.com. So, Gavin, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you on our show.
Thank you for having me, Tessa. It's a real pleasure to participate on this.
So we're diving into something most of us wrestle with at some point in time, which is how do we lead our careers instead of letting them lead us? So many leaders today are asking big questions about purpose, pace, and priorities. Gavin's insight will help you unpack those questions for yourself. So let's jump in. Gavin, you've held a range of roles and supported countless executives through turning points in their careers. When you think about managing a career with intention, where does that journey really begin?
So that's a great question, Tessa. And the one thing that we often recommend, and we've seen leaders be very successful at, is starting with what gives each leader. So if I'm speaking to a leader, it's what gives you joy. Where do you find satisfaction in the roles that you're in, and where do you want to focus? So I think there's a tendency for people, especially earlier on, to pursue careers or pursue progression in companies because they think it's where they should be going. And I think it's important to be able to take a step back and say, what do I enjoy and where do I want to go? That will help. That's really important.
So to our listening audience, I want to invite you to take a beat, maybe grab a notebook or open your notes app and ask yourself, what actually satisfies you in your role? What's energizing? What's draining? You don't have to fix it yet. We just want you to name it. So Gavin, as you talk about, I think for all of us, particularly when we start in our careers, it's just, hey, this is the pathway. That's what you do. You go do it. But you've worked with leaders who feel stuck, who feel pressure to keep climbing, or even when the summit doesn't feel right anymore. What advice do you give most often when someone isn't sure of what's next?
So I think there's an opportunity to step back and, again, reflect on where your interest lies, but also to be able to talk to other people in your profession, to explore how they've managed their career, the decisions that they have made. I often find that is something that they can draw on and becomes very helpful. And, I think about, and I've seen many instances where people will pivot to again go in the direction where, and especially in my area in the insurance field, where there's ample opportunity to keep pivoting where you see a better fit. And I think it's being able to step back and keep in mind a number of things. One, where your passion is, where the company, where your skill set is going to be needed, and where the growth areas of the company are as well. So keeping all those factors in mind.
That's great advice. And it resonates for me personally. I remember earlier in my career, it was probably my late 20s, working for Citibank in New York. And, everything in that time, I was, going up the career path in human resources. And it was like the space to be in was compensation. And that just wasn't a space that brought excitement or passion. It wasn't where my skill sets lied. And there was an area of HR that was less popular, less trendy, and it was around talent management, talent development. But that's where I had passion and where I had a lot of interest. And I was excited by that. And I had an opportunity from Citigroup to go into executive comp And it was like, oh, you're just foolish if you don't take this role. This is where everyone's going. This is a direct path to the top. And I just, to your point, fortunately, I had the balance of listening to my inner voice. And as you mentioned, talking to other people to get guidance and advice, and realize, like, as much as that pathway seems like it's the way to go, it just wasn't the way to go for me. And I chose the talent management, talent development path, and it has so served me over the course of my careers. I have since learned through assessments and other things. Part of it was I don't have good attention to detail. So I probably wouldn't have been a very good compensation person. But my strengths lie in being strategic and futuristic. My strength lies in helping people unpack their hopes and dreams. So talent management and talent development made a lot more sense, even as I did the science behind who I am, which came later. So I think what you're talking about, I think our listeners, this is important for you as well. And maybe you've chased a title because you thought you quote unquote should, or maybe you've lost sight of what actually lights you up. Take this time to reflect on a time when you pursued alignment instead of achievement, and what changed for you. So I love this bit of passion, strengths, where the organization is going, where you can find alignment. But, life isn't always neat and packaged and simple like that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about grit. What happens when what you want feels rare or just out of reach? And how do you define good enough in that moment?
I always feel like a good first step is having those conversations with your manager, those regular reviews, the regular conversations to outline your objectives for your career, your interests. And it's always a chance for that leader to validate or advise if you're not aligned. So I think that's a great first step from within the company. And if you get to a point now, sometimes, and I see these discussions, they can be really constructive, because and I think some people are would prefer to avoid the difficult conversations and continue on the path. But if you can have those honest conversations with your manager, that's a great first step. Now, the question that you just asked, Tessa, was a good one. There are times where that manager just may not be willing to have that conversation, or may not be sophisticated enough or a strong enough people manager to do that. And we see that often. And what we see works really well is for a person to be able to go and speak to others within the company. And again, test out what they're thinking about for their career, what they're thinking about for their objectives. And what I've seen is if their own manager might be a roadblock, those other people can sometimes help navigate, give them advice, or open doors for them. And again, it's so important to do it in a way where their manager doesn't feel like they're going around them, but it's more of that opening the door, engaging in a conversation, a career discussion. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's great insight, because, the truth of the matter is not every leader has a manager who champions them, right? Some face politics, some face protectionism, especially I've seen this a lot in HR, where it's like, hey, this is a great person on my team. I don't want to give up a great person because they help me and the team look good. And I think your counsel around, when you have a leader who may not support your growth, where else can you go? And whether that's to other people inside of your organization, but I'm curious to get your thoughts as well. For me, I found it's also important to have relationships in a network outside of your organization. Some of our listeners aren't working in multinationals filled with, tens of thousands of people. They may be in a 200, 300 person office, or a 20 person office, right? So there may not feel like there's political or psychological safety to have those conversations, but they still need some place to go to talk and get guidance around their careers. What have you found are ways that they can build those relationships if they don't have them outside of the organization, and other tactics you counsel people to explore?
That's great. And we started talking about the internal discussions, but it's great to pivot to the external. So there's a couple of things that I would recommend. Number one, the people that you worked with in the past are often great people to have conversations with, to be able to brainstorm and have those broader career discussions. And I've found that to be always very, very helpful. The other piece that I would say is, and this is something that we see in the searches we do, the trading partners. So if you're in a key sales role, the people that you're selling to, or whatever those partners are, will often have great insights on the market and opportunities, and will know what other companies are doing and how they're hiring and the types of roles that they're hiring for. So again, it requires a little bit of thoughtfulness and how you position yourself, because you don't necessarily want to put yourself out there, depending on how well you know and trust the person you're speaking to. But it's a great way to gather information, and it's a great way to plant a seed so that people know that maybe they should keep you in mind if the right opportunity comes.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I just want to invite our listening audience, if this hits close to home, you're not alone. I want to encourage you to really, as Gavin is talking about, think about what you can control. Who maybe, whether they're inside your organization, in your direct chain of command, or outside of that, who can help you grow. And as Gavin's mentioned, how to be thoughtful about that, reach out, ask questions, build that bridge. And for those who may say, I don't have anyone inside or outside I can talk to, that's the first starting point, is how do you broaden your network? Because we will need others along the journey with us to have the kind of careers we desire. And Gavin, as you know, career decisions aren't just professional, they're deeply personal. And so how do you guide leaders in bringing their families into the decisions before they're at the point in which they need to make a decision, whether to leave or stay or take on something broader in responsibility?
Yeah, great question, Tessa. So often in the work that we do, where we are recruiting global roles and broad regional roles, it will sometimes require a relocation or a big change to the family. And the one thing that, again, we've seen work very well is when the person considering a role is involving their partner and the family a little earlier than later. Right. Earlier to be able to have time to absorb the information, ask questions, engage. If what we have found is when candidates considering roles start that conversation a little bit later, it can become a little bit more overwhelming for the family to absorb those decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also great to get insights from others, right? So again, really important to speak to the people you trust and keep that circle relatively small, but know who those people are. And I feel fortunate that often when senior leaders are considering a role, even if we might not even be involved and they could be dealing directly with the company, right, they'll reach out to us because they know that they can trust me, and we've built a long-standing relationship. So here I am, an executive recruiter, and I'm sometimes in that role. But I'd say to take that step back and to think about the people in your circle that you can trust, and be able to run those ideas by them.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. You know, as you talk about that, it makes me think of times where I've been in-house with an organization and hiring an executive, and we're at the point we're making an offer, and now that executive, right, like they go home to talk to their family about it, and suddenly there's a lot more complexity, right? So we've been in this multi-month courting process. We're ready to sign the deal, and suddenly that executive underestimated, right, impact on family, or underestimated how the home front would respond, or the willingness to move. And what we thought would be, a couple of weeks of decision making, starts to become an ask of months, because that executive now needs to take their partners or their family members along the journey, which can be quite challenging, right, on both sides of the equation. But I haven't just experienced it as an organization trying to hire top talent. I've experienced it myself as well. There's an opportunity that often comes up in my household where it was an opportunity to move from Texas, where we are now, to Northern California. Great opportunity, really excited about it. But it wasn't the best time for our family to make a move for our son. And I remember we talked a lot about it. I tried to negotiate with the company because, like you said, I was talking to the recruiter. I was talking to my personal network of how to get creative to still move forward with the opportunity, but buy time for some of the caregiving and child rearing needs that we had. And at the end of the day, the company wasn't amenable to a more creative model, and I pulled away. They turned around and said, what if, the compensation was not a barrier? You could ask for your price. We're that committed to you coming out. It was one of those, like, as much as that's exciting and that is complimentary, that still doesn't work for our family, and I'm going to choose the needs of the family. But we were already contracted as a family along that process. So we were able to stand firm in that. And so even though I didn't pursue that opportunity, the reason it comes up in my household, because we were transparent with our son about it, who is now a teenager, he will often say, "Oh, Mom, remember when you gave up that opportunity for me for X, Y, and Z?" And it's actually become a foundation around, values, priorities, what's important. And sometimes you have to make sacrifices, or you give up certain things so you can get other things. So it is in the it's in the deposit of making me a cool mom with our son, but it's also in the deposit of training him about life isn't always easy and simple. And to your point, how do you bring people along so that intentionality is there?
So, Tessa, I love the points that you raised, and I'd like to unpack a couple of points that you raised. So, there's, again, looking at a role and an opportunity and how it aligns with you, very important. And then looking at how does that opportunity fit within your family situation, and is it sustainable? Really important. Understanding the company's flexibility, really having those conversations early on are critical. Right. But I also like that when the question came up about compensation, and let's make that a non-factor, it's interesting because I would say that always has to be far down on the list. Everything else matters first. The role, the alignment with your values and the culture, the making it work for the family, and then compensation. Because if those other pieces aren't there, it won't work. It won't work for the long term. So I think being really mindful, and I think, I sometimes see, or especially senior leaders at a senior level, I think people understand that, and if not, we remind them. But certainly at an earlier level, it's easy to forget it, or it's to see a big compensation change and to get excited by that. I always encourage both clients and candidates to really focus on the fit with the role, the long-term growth potential. All those pieces are really important. Only when all of those elements are met should we focus on comp. And I remember once one of our hiring managers said, well, if compensation is the only thing, let's really make that very attractive. I said, but then it won't be sustainable. So I think those are good reminders.
Yeah, and I think to your point, right? Like we can't skip the practical stuff, right? So compensation plays a role, and these days, return to office expectations can play a role in someone's decision making. But to your point, even though money matters, we can't let it be. It needs to be part of the picture, but not the whole canvas. And I think the message to our readers here is, for those who are in the process of considering opportunities or what's next, what would enough look like for you? Not just financially enough, but how your life actually feels day to day, right? To your point, are you tapping into passion? Are you a part of a team that you enjoy being a part of? Are you doing work that builds your skill set or leverages your strengths? Are you contributing? Maybe the work you're doing helps to contribute to society in a bigger way. Maybe it's a team dynamic in a bigger way. But I think to your point, tapping into those intrinsic values and not just myopically focusing on the extrinsic ones that aren't sustainable and can shift and change. But those, if we get the intrinsic ones right, it's easier to weather the storm when there's fluctuation in the extrinsic ones.
That makes great sense. And I'd love to give a couple of examples, even as we talk about the journey and decisions that people make. I was thinking about a couple of examples. So I'm thinking about a former CEO, big global CEO, and he had left his company and was looking at different opportunities, and there were opportunities at even bigger companies to be that next CEO. And then there were other opportunities, again, challenging and dynamic, but not necessarily that CEO title or the obvious next step. And I saw, we went through the discussions and we went through the analysis, and he came to the conclusion that the growth-oriented role that was going to allow him to really support and enable the leaders to be successful in a challenging role, but not necessarily the one that earlier in his career he probably would have pursued, because he was doing what he wanted to do at a certain point. And I think that that's really empowering and a great long-term decision.
I'm curious to get your thoughts around this because both in the examples I gave about my journey, the example you just gave about the CEO, it's very different, the options you have when you're at the latter part of your career, when you're at the upper end of the pyramid, right? When you have more, it's a catch-22. Like as a pyramid is shaped, there are fewer roles at the top and more people, but you actually have more power and more optionality and more room to negotiate when you're at the top than you do when you're at the bottom. And so I think a lot of what we've been talking about, it makes sense for the long-term play. But what happens when sometimes you do need to take that in-between role that may not tap into as much passion, and maybe you're doing it just for 3 years because it positions you, it gives you the skill set you need, it helps you cross over that financial threshold. Sometimes there's the middle decisions that need to be short-term in nature because they are facilitators for the longer-term play. I'm curious how you coach leaders as they navigate where sometimes you got to give up a little bit of your, preferred and ultimate desired state in order to get to that preferred and desired state.
Yeah, and so I will give you my coaching advice and my own personal experience. I think that's a good point. I think that sometimes as I am speaking with a leader, they've come to the conclusion that they really want to shift into a different area, and an area that will require them to take a step back or maybe a lateral move. And I think as long as they can understand and do their homework so they know that it's going to be a pivot. It's going to require a certain period of time, but will allow them to catch up and then progress in the direction that they want. I think that's a good decision. The key is that you do your homework and you're not taking a flyer. And I'll tell you, I'll take you on my own personal journey.
Before you take us on that personal journey, what do you mean by a flyer?
Oh, I think I think that it requires us to do our homework, right? We need to know if we're going to shift into a new area, what's involved, what are the skills that will be required, how will success be measured, how does that fit with one's own capabilities? And if they believe, yes, this is going to be a good fit and I could see the progression and I'm excited by it, then go do it.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Thank you for that. So your personal experience.
So my own personal experience was, so this is now quite a few years ago, but I was an insurance litigation lawyer, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't see myself doing it for the rest of my career. And I had become exposed to executive search through a friend. And at a certain point I said, I want to go do that. And I was still relatively early in my career, but at that point I had the trappings of and the benefits of being a young lawyer with a lot of support behind me. And I remember leaving that and joining an executive search firm where I had a tiny office. I was doing anything and everything, and really beginning at the beginning. But I saw the opportunity and I saw the potential to do more. And so I didn't, the compensation wasn't great at the beginning, but I saw that potential, and I was able to quickly take on more and progress and ultimately get to where I wanted to get to. So I do think that being thoughtful is important. And along the way, there were people, when I actually went in and resigned to go into executive search, the partners at that law firm thought that I was a little crazy and said, this is the career that you have in front of you, and wouldn't you want to stay? And I said, but I never want to stay just because of the risk of what I'm leaving behind, and I want to go pursue my own dream and my own passion. So I do think that's important.
I love that story. And when you talk with leaders, like you said, who are interested in maybe exploring something different or making a pivot, whether it's lateral or what have you, or maybe even a step back, and even the shift you made, talk to our listeners a little bit about what that looks like or how that feels differently when you're, young, single, no responsibilities, when you're married or partnered up and no kids, but when you're, a bit more entrenched in life with preset, overhead and, a lifestyle that requires a certain something. Like, how do you balance the trade-offs in those pursuits? And is it ever too late? Right? Because I do hear that a lot from leaders as well.
I think those are all important questions. I think it's thinking about how can you maybe mitigate that risk? How is there a way that you can create and to work with your partner and looking at how can you make a new role work? How can you make the compensation work? What do you need to give it to try something new?
Right.
And I think that's really important. So yes, you might not be able to do everything, and but you should. But I think you really. I want to encourage people to feel like there are options and there are doors that can be opened, and if it's the right opportunity, there is potential. I've seen many people take on more creative, more entrepreneurial opportunities and really work on how to make it work.
Yeah, that's well said. I, as you were saying that, it made me think about leaders who, were intentional about timing when they would do that. So doing it when the kids are starting elementary school, that their relationships aren't completely locked, so it's not disruptive, or willing to move, but moving to a lower cost of living city, so that, to your point, they can make the shift and the change, or a lower cost of living area of town, right? So maybe they're not in the ideal zip code, but they're still in a zip code with good schools, but they've sort of decreased their overhead to create room or margin. And I've also seen here in Texas, it's very common to have single working households with dual parents, but maybe once kids are out of elementary school, both parents, right, are now back into the workforce to create that optionality to explore different things. So I think, to your point, reminding our readers, right, our listeners rather, it's never too late. It's really about how creative can you be, and what kind of optionality, because we don't want to feel that loss of control, like, well, I just have to keep doing this. We have choices. And so how do we own those choices?
I couldn't agree more.
Well, Gavin, thank you so much for this generous and very grounded conversation. You've given us more than advice. You've given us really permission to be honest, thoughtful, and strategic with our careers. For our listeners, if you want to learn more about Gavin's work or connect with him directly, visit graniteintl.com. Whether you're an executive exploring new possibilities in the insurance industry, or you're an organization searching for the right leader, he and his team can help you get there. We've also created a free companion resource filled with reflection prompts and practical tools to help you bring this episode to life. You can find it in the show notes or at tessatubbs.com. And if today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love your support. Follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or visit us at our website for even more content. And in the meantime, remember, lead the change you envision. Thank you, Gavin. It was wonderful having you today.
Thank you for having me, Tessa.